Okay. Now, so this is just going over what we went over. We have a normal cell, and then we have an unregulated cell, or unregulated cells forms a tumor. Doesn't mean it's cancer. If it's not invasive, it means it's benign. It's usually better to be benign than cancerous, obviously, but there are benign tumors that are pretty bad. A common one is a pituitary gland tumor. So it's benign, but it can kill people. Now, of course, if it's invasive, it's called malignant. If it doesn't move, it's non-metastatic because it's metastatic. Okay. Now, along the bottom here, we have the answers. Cancer cells differ from normal cells. They divide when they shouldn't. And it's because of what? Anybody? Take a wild guess. Huh? Is it a loss of anchorage dependence? Is it loss of cell cycle control or contact inhibition? It's 1 out of 3 chances. What?
Anchorage dependence.
No. That's okay. Now we're down to 50%. What do you think? Cell cycle, now, divide when it shouldn't. Is it cell cycle control or contact inhibition? Yeah, cell cycle. Okay? So, invading surrounding tissues is because of a loss of what? Contact inhibition or anchorage dependence? What do you think? 50-50. That's right. And then if it moves to other locations, then you have a loss of anchorage dependence. So anchorage dependence is it basically it's got proteins on the cell surface that make the cell sticky. And so they stick to other cells around them, and they don't move like normal cells. But if they decide to go on a little vacation up to the brain, let's say, if you have a liver cancer, then they travel along and they've lost anchorage dependence, and they can form kind of brotherhoods all over the body. It's really a great thing. Okay, now, radiation therapy. Is it, what is it ineffective? Whether it's contact inhibition, anchorage dependence, or the ability to undergo apoptosis. Apoptosis, remember what that is? It means the cell is like taking a gun to its head and is going to play Russian roulette, except all the chambers are filled. Okay? And actually they're doing it because someone else is holding the gun to them. So that means death, cell death. Now, if you remember, the immune system during the cell cycle, it has these checkpoints, and if a cell is showing some funky stuff like mutations, then these proteins are involved, they recognize that, and then they make the cell commit suicide. With radiation, basically what you're doing is you're causing lots of mutations. So when these cells start to divide, they're already damaged, and then they automatically commit suicide. But if they have lost the ability to undergo apoptosis because of, let's say, it's a tumor suppressor gene, then radiation will not really work very well on those cells. Because all you're doing with radiation is basically damaging cells, and then those will be thrown on the trash heap normally. So why is it good to take multiple biopsies from a single tumor? Because unregulated cell division leads to increased genetic diversity. Does that sound right? Yeah? It does. Because a given drug may be effective against only one part of the tumor. That's kind of true, yeah. Because a tumor evolution can occur. Tumors, just like people or other organisms, can evolve. You start with one cell with a mutation, they give rise to new cells with that mutation, and plus maybe some more mutations. So all of these are true. Okay. Now, sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. These are bacteria. And these bacteria actually, they're doing something kind of like sex. They're exchanging genetic material. It's called conjugation. But they still reproduce asexually. In other words, they make copies of themselves and they bud off and they create new copies. Okay? So now, conjugation is kind of like, imagine you're having sex with someone. Well, instead of just donating your genetic information to offspring, you're actually donating it to their genome, and they're donating it to your genome. And so suddenly you wouldn't be you anymore. You'd be basically all the traits that in both genomes. Some would be the same, some would be different. Okay? So that's what conjugation is. Now, you can also have the same sort of thing with multicellular organisms, like this planaria. You could cut this up, and each piece will generate into a whole new planaria. They'll be identical to the parent. They do this by mitosis. Okay? On the left is another parasite, Giardia, or Giardia, that you get from drinking contaminated water. And they also can produce asexually. Now, sometimes you have organisms that can reproduce asexually and sexually, depending on the environment. I'm not going to get into that right now. Okay. The cells of your body that do not give rise to sperm and eggs, what is it called? Somatic cells. And those that do, germline. Okay. So here's some vocabulary. Now, let's take a look at this right here first. This is a homologous pair of chromosomes. We'll say one from dad and one from mom. Okay? And that makes mom or dad diploid. That means they've got two copies of the same chromosome. They're identical chromosomes in terms of what genes are on them, but they might have different alleles. Okay. So this is a homologous pair of chromosomes. This is a non-homologous pair over here. These are different chromosomes. Up here, oops. Okay. This is a karyotype of all of our chromosomes. You can see there's always a pair, like here. This is a pair. Now, as you can see here and here, those are two different chromosomes, so they're not homologous. There's 22 identical pairs of chromosomes for humans. That means that's 44. But there are also sex chromosomes. 2 X's, that means you have a female. And then, let's see. XY is a male. So XY, that's the male, XX female. And that's one of the reasons why if you have a mutation on either the X or the Y, you've got problems usually. The males are going to have problems like color blindness, insanity, all kinds of stuff. So can this be obtained from a cell at any stage of the cell cycle? Who says yes? Who says no? Okay. A for you. No, only when the DNA condenses during mitosis. Okay. So our somatic cells have 2 of each chromosome. These cells are, of course, diploid. Human cells have 23 somatic, somatic cells is 23 times 2 is 46. That includes the X and the Y. Now, an egg and a sperm, they don't have homologous chromosomes, do they? They only have a single chromosome. It's 23 single chromosomes. What does it show here as far as, doesn't show an X or a Y. Anyway, now, when you only have one copy of the chromosomes, one of the 23 instead of 2, 46, then you have a haploid individual. Haploid means only one copy of that chromosome. Gametes, in terms of sexual reproduction, are always haploid, unless something's gone haywire. So, and then, of course, when 2 gametes, 2 haploid cells come together, they form a zygote and they restore diploidy to the zygote, which will then replicate, differentiate into an organism. Those 2 gametes, they're different. Well, for humans, they're different size. There are some organisms that only have one size gametes, so there's really no sex, different sexes, but they still join together and form a zygote. For us, male sperm, female's eggs. So, haploid, eggs and sperm, these are haploid cells because they only have one of each of the 23 chromosomes. Okay, now meiosis, meiosis is where we actually get sperm and eggs. And meiosis is in the germline cells. In other words, if you have a mutation in your skin cell, you can't pass it on to your offspring. And then when you have, like in this case, a sperm and an egg, fertilization restores the diploid number of chromosomes, namely 2 times 23. Okay, so how would you design meiosis? Well, let's think about this. In mitosis, you replicate all the DNA so that you'll have double the number of copies of DNA so that each new cell will have a full diploid genome, right? If you were to then take those cells and do it further, you would then split apart those homologous pairs of chromosomes, and one would go into one gamete and the other would go into another gamete. Okay, so basically you're adding some steps in terms of going from mitosis to meiosis. In the end, with mitosis, you end up with a perfectly identical daughter cell. In meiosis, you don't. You end up with a haploid, single chromosome cell that eventually, if it's lucky enough, will fertilize or be fertilized. So it starts with mitosis, just like that. Meiosis is pretty much, you replicate, if you, in the cycle, you go from G1 to S, you replicate all the DNA, then you go into G2, and then meiosis starts. Okay, so here's our cell cycle again. Now, if we actually look at this, okay, so here's our parent cell, and okay, this is prophase in mitosis. The chromosomes condense. So you have 2 sister chromatids, and they all line up on the metaphase plate, and then they start to be pulled apart. And then finally you end up with 2 daughter cells at the bottom that are diploid. Now, meiosis, a little bit different. First of all, there's an extra step here. In prophase 1, because there's 2 cycles of in meiosis, phase 1 and phase 2. So prophase 1, you've got double the number of chromosomes. You've got now these tetrads, and there's something called crossing over, which we'll get to, where the chromosomes actually exchange parts of themselves. And then, of course, you have a metaphase 1, and these chromosomes are then pulled apart during anaphase, and you've got 2 diploid cells still, daughter cells of meiosis 1. Now, when you go through meiosis 2, you go through all this again, but in the end, you only end up with 4 haploid gametes. Okay. So here we are again. Let's see. Hold on. Here. That's good. Okay. So here's okay. So interphase up on top. Okay. Prophase 1. You've got all these double number of chromosomes. They go through prophase 1, metaphase 1, where they line up on the plate. During this, they also do crossing over. And then they finally go to anaphase 1, where they pull apart. They go to telophase, and then cytokinesis. So you've got 2 daughter cells with a full complement of chromosomes. And then meiosis 2, you have, here we go, meiosis 2. Oh yeah, products, right. So you have basically prophase for meiosis 2, metaphase for meiosis 2. So these 2 daughter cells, they split apart, the chromosomes are pulled apart so that each one is now going to be a haploid cell. And then in telophase, you get 4 daughter cells. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, it turns out with females, you only end up with 1 of those gametes. There's these other polar cells that are involved in some other things you don't have to understand. So, in meiosis 1, there's this 1 extra cell division that's inserted there. Okay. Now, meiosis occurs in what? Germline or somatic cells? Good. Okay. And produces haploid or diploid gametes. Diploid? No, haploid. The only time you end up with diploid is when 2 gametes come together, and then each has a set of chromosomes, and now you have a homologous pair of chromosomes in the diploid state. The fertilized egg is called the, anybody? Okay, and is it haploid or diploid? Yes, exactly. Diploid. Okay, so during meiosis is when you get the haploid state. That way that when you have fertilization, you get 1 copy from your mom and 1 copy from your dad. Right? And that restores the diploid condition. And then, of course, the zygote starts undergoing mitosis over and over again, replicating cells, then differentiating cells, all that, until you finally have, let's say, a whole human being. Okay. Why have, anybody have an idea why have sex? Anybody? How about feels great? Right? Okay. I mean, we can agree on that. So that's why we have sex. Pretty much. Now, some people might decide that they want a little bit more, like a screaming infant, and if they want that, then they'll eventually have less sex. Okay. But they'll have a screaming infant that then grows up and takes your money for the rest of your life. It's great. Okay. Now, the thing is, when we talked about evolution earlier, we talked a little bit about this. This is a long time in the past. But asexual reproduction is actually a more efficient way of passing on your genes, because if you make a clone of yourself, they're exactly like you. That's 100% of your genes. If you undergo sexual reproduction, you're only donating half. So parents and children are half related to each other. Okay, so there's a cost. Why would you want to do this? There has to be some reason to pay such a twofold cost, right? Okay. Oh yeah. There's a great book by a woman named Olivia Judson. It's a kick. I mean, even for you guys. Dr. Tatiana's Sex Advice for All Creation, or to All Creation. She goes, if you think human beings have wild sex, nah, nothing. Nothing compared to other organisms in the world. I mean, just nothing. Okay, so you can learn a little bit about it. And let's take a look. Well, first of all, besides feeling good, it can be costly and complicated and potentially dangerous. First of all, if you just make a copy of yourself, you don't have to go looking for it. And then when you find it, you don't have to go, then you have to actually go through all the, drinks and all that kind of stuff, right? Plus, there's STDs, things like that. Also, forget about humans, but in some other animals, sex is, well, it's rough. It's just plain rough. In fact, when I was talking about the Tasmanian devils and the cancerous tumors that they pass to each other, that's an example of rough sex. So, now, asexual reproduction, of course, you clone yourself. The only drawback is if you clone yourself, but you actually hate yourself, then you got two of you to hate instead of just yourself. Okay, so gametes get one of each pair. Which one? It's random. When they line up on the metaphase plate, they can go either direction, to one cell or the other. In other words, one gamete might go to the left, or to your left, or to the right, or it could be the other way around. So this adds the potential for diversity in individuals because they've got two gametes, right, and two homologous chromosomes, one from each parent for each of the chromosomes. Now, there's something called independent assortment. Mendel, the guy who discovered genes, and because you have two homologous chromosomes, but there's 23 different chromosomes, you raise that 2 to the 23rd power, that's like 8 million types of gametes. Now, there's another thing, random fertilization. It could be one of the 4 gametes, or the second gamete, or the third gamete, or the 4th gamete sperm that fertilizes the egg. It's kind of like a random crapshoot. So each child is a unique combination of traits, except for identical twins, like you. Do you love yourself? What about your identical twin? Okay. That's a good thing. Otherwise, you'd be in therapy. Okay. So sex inserts a lot of randomness into which genes that you actually get. Now, if an organism was living in an environment that didn't change, and it had enough time to adapt to that environment, sex would be not called for. I mean, you've already got all the alleles that made you fit, right? So you don't need any wild alleles thrown in there. That's just going to lower the fitness of the offspring. But we rarely live in an environment that's stable, and it's different, it's heterogeneous, either in space or different places or time. So we live here in California, Southern California, we don't really get a winter. You go up to Alaska, you'll get a winter, right? So you look at in the populations up there that have adapted to that, like the Inuit, they are adapted to that environment. And they actually have some features that make them better fit compared to us down here. We can still interbreed, still human beings, but there's different alleles that are better in certain environments than others. So because of that environmental differences, heterogeneity, sex can actually be a benefit. Especially if we consider one of the major sources of mortality for people are pathogens and parasites. Salute. Okay, so that's been a constant. Of course, we don't die of certain things anymore because we have antibiotics, but in general, those were the things that would be killing lots of people. Now, it turns out pathogens replicate much faster than human beings do. So we have an adaptive immune system that actually changes during our lifetime. But with sexual reproduction, you get recombination of different genes each time you have two gametes coming together. Okay, all those different 64 trillion combinations. So it's a likelihood with a sexually reproducing organism that you're going to at least get one individual that actually is at least somewhat resistant to the pathogen, to the disease-causing organism. Okay. Monozygotic twins, they're identical. What's happened is, early on, there was one egg, one fertilization, and then as the cells replicated, they got split, and so you ended up with two independent embryos with the same exact genetic information. In some cases, in many cases, they look similar. There might be some slight differences. They might act differently or the same. A famous case is these two boys, identical twins that were separated at birth. One went with one parent back to Germany. The other stayed here. And then it was during the war. So the German identical twin, became a Nazi. The American boy, they were actually Jewish. He was a Jewish Nazi. It's kind of a contradiction in terms, but the American was, taught to go and kill Germans, right, and Nazis. Well, eventually, one of them heard that there was a twin, and that he had an identical twin in Germany. Now you can imagine, there's a Nazi hater, and then there's a Jewish Nazi who hates himself, right, because he's Jewish. Dave Chappelle. Anyway. Okay, so they actually met. They were both married to a woman with the same name. Really. They also had many of the very same mannerisms, indicating how strong the genetics were compared to, let's say, the different environments, right? Now, it turns out that they decided not to ever talk politics. But they ended up getting along famously. Now, the thing is, identical twins aren't exactly identical, for one reason. They share a maternal environment in the womb, but once they're born, they're kind of like off on their own trajectories. If they're raised in the same environment, they're what's called an epigenome that kind of regulates gene expression. They end up with the same sort of epigenome that evolves along with them. But if eventually they're going to be ending up in different environments. And so they're going to be slightly different from each other from that time on. They'll have the same genes, but they might have different expression patterns. Okay, dizygotic twins, 2 ovulated eggs. So you start with 2 eggs, and each one gets fertilized, and you end up with 2 individuals that are essentially siblings, just full siblings, half related to each other, just like if they had been born at a different time period. So here's a question. This is a worm. It's a very small worm. It's called C. elegans. And in fact, there's a woman here, a researcher, who uses C. elegans as a model organism. Anyway, C. elegans actually produces sperm, which it stores. Doesn't release them right away. It can actually also switch production to eggs. It can do both. That's called, in other words, it's a hermaphrodite. The eggs can be fertilized by its own sperm. Okay? Now that's sex. It's not asexual. So this is an example of what's called a sequential hermaphrodite. In fact, probably the most famous one is the clownfish in Nemo, Saving Nemo. Remember that? Okay. It turns out that clownfish, they usually start out as males, and there's a whole group of males and one female who's kind of the dominant individual. So if the female dies, the most dominant male then switches and becomes a female. So there's none of this, how men and women have such a hard time understanding each other. Clownfish, in many cases, they've been both. They can understand the other sex. So they don't have to go all these manuals about women, how women think or how men think and act so differently, right? It's great. But this is actually sexual reproduction. Now, it turns out that plants are the same way. They produce pollen and then an ovary and an egg. But they often have a mechanism that prevents selfing, in other words, self-fertilization. And these C. elegans can do the same sort of thing. Okay, so there's a diploid. So diploid 2N, they get split into 4 different gametes, and then they come back together and fertilize. So these are the haploid cells. Okay. Now, in terms of the cycle of sexual reproduction, well, first of all, you have an individual who's a sexually mature individual, and they produce gametes from the germline. That's the only stuff where you can inherit stuff from germline mutations. Can't do it from somatic cells. Okay. And so there's some cells are set aside for their germline. They undergo meiosis, then fertilization produces a zygote, and then the zygote develops through mitosis. Okay. So your somatic cells have 2 of each chromosome. Are they diploid or haploid? your somatic cells, right? Like your skin cells, your liver cells, all that. Are they haploid or diploid? Diploid, exactly. What are these pairs of chromosomes called when there's one from each parent? Homologous, close. Okay. So the specialized form of cell division that occurs in your germline is meiosis. Gametes have one of each chromosome. And of course, they are haploid. Okay, this is our instruction manual again. Each egg has 23 chromosomes. Each sperm has 23. When they come together, those 23 are homologous chromosomes. You end up with 46. Okay. Now, hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen in our blood from the lungs to the cells for oxidative metabolism. Okay? Now, as you can see, HbA will say that's normal. Hemoglobin A is normal. And it codes for this, what is it? GLU. Glucine. Now, it turns out an individual, there's a mutation, and instead of the original DNA code being GAG, it's now GTG. In other words, the A has been changed to a T. And it now codes for a different amino acid called valine. Valine has some properties about it. One is that the cells that have at least one valine molecule, one copy of it, the cells are different. They can't carry as much oxygen as a normal normal blood cell with hemoglobin, but enough. Then they have two. It means that they have a sickle cell anemia, which is a lethal trait. Okay, but even individuals who are heterozygous, in other words, we're going to learn about that right now. HbA, HbS, they're resistant to malaria, but their ability to carry oxygen is a little bit impaired, but not enough considering if they're in a malarial infested environment. Okay. Here's pictures of normal hemoglobin and what it looks like. It's actually got some sites that attach where oxygen attaches to. And then there's this clumped hemoglobin for when you have the S allele. Okay. And this is what a sickle cell looks like. Now, sickling usually happens mostly in environments where there's not quite enough oxygen or lower oxygen. But if you have two copies of it, then you're going to have problems for the rest of your life unless we get a cure to it. So, here's the alleles again. HbA is the normal, and HbS is the sickling cell allele. And when they're different like this, remember you get 2 copies of each allele. So if you get one normal and one sickling, you have mild sickle cell, but you also are resistant to malaria. If you get 2 copies of normal, you're homozygous. That means either you've got the normal type, HbA, or you've got the sickle cell anemia type, HbS. HbS is lethal in a place where there's endemic malaria. HbA is also lethal. You get malaria, you won't necessarily die, but mostly children do. Kids who get infected, but these guys up here are protected. Okay, so these are the genotypes, and then we're going to say here is going to be the phenotype. Okay, now HbA, normal blood cells, HbS, homozygous, sickle cell anemia, and then HbS, it's both incomplete dominant and codominant, which we're going to learn about. Namely that there's some blood cells that actually have sickling shape, even in the heterozygous form, but not as much as the homozygous form. But they're malaria resistant, and they carry oxygen almost as well. Okay, we already went over this. Some people in here might think this guy's cute, but he's a monster. Okay, now just to remind you, we have a genotype and a phenotype. We did this way back when. Remember when we talked about, let's say you have 2 alleles, A1 and A2, right? And that would be heterozygous. You can also have A1, A2, right? So the same thing down here. HbA, normal. Now the phenotype, how those genes are actually expressed, is, in this case, in the blood cells. In terms of, in general, heterozygotes, those are, let's say, A1, or HbA, HbS, they're carriers of this allele. They're carriers of a recessive allele. The phenotype of a recessive allele only shows up when there's 2 copies of it. HbS. So you can be a carrier, not show any effects, or very little, but you can pass it on to your offspring. And if your significant other also is a carrier, there's a 25% chance that your offspring will have the disease. So there's this idea called recessiveness, and then there's something else called dominance. Okay, so Mendelian genetics, you guys remember that, hopefully. A lot of traits are dominant. So let's go over this. Okay. We're going to say these are flowers. Hold on. Okay. These are the generations, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Here are the parental generation. You have one who's got a red allele and another who's got a white allele. If the red allele is dominant, all their offspring will have red flowers. Okay, every single one of them. But that's because the red allele is dominant and kind of masks the white allele. And so this is called a Punnett square, which we'll go over, but you'll end up with dominance. 3/4 of the offspring will have red flowers, and 1/4 will have white, because even though they're dominant, a lot of them are carriers of the white allele. Now, there's also something called incomplete dominance. Okay, and that's up here. And in this case, each allele, whether they've got a red allele or a white allele, each allele provides a certain amount of that, let's say the red pigment. It doesn't provide all the red pigment that a homozygous individual would be. So when you're homozygous in an incomplete dominance, you're going to have red flowers or white flowers. But in incomplete, you'll end up having pink flowers. And those pink individuals will have one allele from the red parent, one allele from the white parent. Okay? Now, there's also something else. And this is called, I know you love this. Okay, and this is codominance. On codominance is right down here, where it's expressing red and white, but it's expressing them perfectly as complete red and complete white, versus incomplete dominance on the left there. It's an intermediate, so that's called codominance. It turns out that the hemoglobin gene in sickle cell anemia is both incomplete dominance and codominance. It provides some of the carrying oxygen, like being homozygous with the normal type. So it's kind of a mix. And then also it produces red blood cells, some of which are normal and some of which are sickle cell. Okay. So back to this. If A1 is dominant to allele A2, then the dominant phenotype, that means what they look like, is expressed in both the homozygous and heterozygous genotype. Okay, so we're talking about flowers again. If red is dominant, they both will have red, actually, and red, even though that's the heterozygote. Okay? They'll still show red. A phenotype that is seen only as homozygote and recessive has to be the recessive allele, which is A2, so you need 2 copies, and this is a white individual. How did that happen? Anyway, hold on a second. Okay, good. 112. Okay, I think I got it. Okay. Now, here's some examples of dominant traits and recessive traits. Turns out having an allele for freckles is dominant. Some individuals can roll their tongues. Anybody in here roll their tongues? Okay, so that's a dominant trait. Widow's peak, detached earlobes, that's me. Now, recessive, that means you need 2 copies. A cleft chin. Albinism, where you have an individual who doesn't make pigment, is a recessive trait where you need 2 copies. Hitchhiker's thumb, and then attached earlobes. Those are recessive traits. Only one of those is a diseased or pathological phenotype. It's just dominant or recessive in terms of inheritance patterns and expression patterns more specifically. Okay. Let me see some.